How to pass the winding stairs, a guide to mental mastery. Okay. Hook. What separates the Mason who achieves genuine mental mastery from the one who simply advances through the degrees? The answer lives in a level-up system embedded in the winding stairs that most Masons walk past every single year. The 3, 5, and 7 steps aren't just symbolic. They form a complete mental development framework, each stage building on the one before it. Modern neuroscience confirms what Masonic tradition has taught for centuries. The mind climbs in stages, and each stage builds on the one before it. Discovering the hidden staircase. The winding stairs appear in the Fellowcraft Degree, the second of the 3 craft degrees in Freemasonry. If you walk into any Blue Lodge during the Fellowcraft lecture, you will encounter a description of a staircase with 15 steps grouped into 3, 5, and 7. Most Masons have heard this description dozens of times in their lives. They know the words. They have probably repeated them. But almost none of them have ever stopped to ask what those numbers actually mean, why they are grouped in that particular way, and what the whole system was designed to do. The biblical origin sits in a brief passage from the first book of Kings. In 1 Kings 6:8, the text notes that the door for the middle chamber was in the right side of the house, and they went up with winding stairs into the middle chamber, and out of the middle into the third. That passage originally described 3 stories of side chambers used for priestly vestments and temple equipment, arranged around the main structure of Solomon's temple. But 18th century Freemasons seized on this brief, somewhat obscure mention and transformed it into an elaborate myth about a stairway leading to a middle chamber where fellow crafts received their wages. Albert Mackey and other Masonic scholars writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries argued convincingly that there is no historical evidence for a middle chamber used to pay workmen's wages in the biblical temple. The passage describes storage rooms for priests, not a pay office. Mackey called the Masonic legend an historical myth, built on a slender biblical phrase but bearing tremendous symbolic weight that has nothing to do with archaeology. The recognition that the winding stairs story is mythic rather than factual matters enormously for how you read it. It prevents naive literalism that would try to map every ritual detail onto what historians can actually verify about ancient Jerusalem. Instead, it highlights what Mackey and later authors emphasized. The legend's value lies entirely in the symbolism it conveys about moral and intellectual ascent. When you recognize that the winding stairs are a myth, you free yourself to read them properly. Freemasonry intentionally created a symbolic edifice, a staircase and chamber that never literally existed in any temple, to dramatize a real inner journey that each Mason is expected to undertake. This is what Freemasonry does best. It takes the language and tools of a manual craft and repurposes them to teach moral philosophy and self-knowledge. The rough ashlar and the perfect ashlar are not about stone cutting. They are about the human being as an unrefined stone gradually shaped into a polished one through discipline and insight. The square compasses, level, and plumb are not just tools for working stone. They are emblems of virtues such as honesty, self-restraint, equality, and uprightness. In the same way, the winding stairs are not about a staircase in Jerusalem. They are about the architecture of your own mind. This approach to symbolism aligns closely with how modern scholars of religion and ritual understand initiatory myths. These narratives are designed to encode and transmit psychological and ethical wisdom rather than historical facts. The next 5 steps connect with the 5 orders of architecture and, more practically for the individual Mason, with the 5 human senses. The 5 classical orders, Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite, represent different solutions to the fundamental architectural problem of how to span space and bear weight while maintaining beauty and proportion. The 5 senses, hearing, seeing, touch, taste, and smell, represent the embodied channels through which the mind receives information from the world. Both clusters address the question of how structure enables function, and both prepare the fellow craft for the more demanding intellectual work that lies ahead. The final 7 steps refer explicitly to the 7 liberal arts and sciences: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Historically, these disciplines formed the core of classical education from medieval times through the Renaissance, divided into the trivium of language and reasoning and the quadrivium of number and cosmos. Masonic writers emphasize that these arts are branches of wisdom and that they equip the individual to understand the world, communicate effectively, reason correctly, and contemplate both the order of nature and the laws of the grand architect. The Fellowcraft is thereby charged to be a lifelong learner, extending his education beyond formal schooling into a continuous exploration of nature, science, and human culture. Together, these 3 groups of steps, 3, 5, and 7, symbolize the entire progressive education of a Fellowcraft Mason. They move from the foundational moral and structural supports of the lodge, through the disciplined use of the senses and embodied faculties, to the full intellectual curriculum of classical learning. This is not just a symbolic checklist. It is a complete system for developing the human mind. What makes this structure genuinely remarkable is what happens when you put it beside what modern neuroscience tells us about how the brain develops. The 2 pictures converge with striking precision. The stage architecture of the winding stairs, foundation first, then refinement, then mastery, maps onto the developmental sequence that neuroscience has documented across decades of research. Executive function must be in place before higher reasoning can operate reliably. Sensory processing must be refined before complex information can be integrated. Abstract thinking builds on concrete operations that must come first. The winding stairs encode this sequence not because their inventors read neuroscience journals, they developed long before neuroscience existed, but because Masonic tradition contains accumulated wisdom about how human beings actually develop, that has been validated by centuries of practical experience and is now being confirmed by laboratory research. The question we are going to explore together is not whether the winding stairs are metaphorically similar to how the brain develops. That would be interesting, but ultimately abstract. The question is what happens when you read them as a literal level-up system for the human mind, as a practical framework for genuine mental development that you can apply in your own life starting today. And that is what we are going to discover in the chapters that follow. Why your brain needs a staircase. The problem with most learning, most self-improvement, and most education is that it does not account for how the brain actually works. People approach learning as if the mind were a container to be filled with more information, more facts, more techniques, and that eventually you become better through accumulation. But the brain is not a container. It is a dynamic physical system that builds itself in stages, and those stages must proceed in the right order if the final structure is going to hold. Modern neuroscience has established beyond reasonable doubt the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. This was a revolutionary understanding. For much of the 20th century, scientists believed that the brain was essentially fixed after childhood, that neurons you had were the neurons you would always have, and that the best you could hope for was to use what you were born with. The connections become faster and more reliable. But the converse is equally true. Pathways that are not used tend to weaken and eventually disappear. The brain is constantly remodeling itself based on what you actually do, not just what you know or intend to do. The prefrontal cortex manages what neuroscientists call executive functions, the set of cognitive processes that support goal-directed behavior, self-control, and flexible adaptation. Executive function encompasses the ability to maintain goals in mind while working on a complex task, to inhibit impulses that conflict with long-term aims, to switch tasks when the situation demands it, and to regulate emotion in service of larger objectives. Without this executive infrastructure, higher learning is unstable. You can acquire knowledge, but you cannot apply it reliably under pressure. You can understand concepts in the abstract, but you cannot integrate them into your actual decision-making when the stakes are real. The knowledge does not become part of you because there is no structure to hold it. Research on cognitive development has documented in great detail how executive functions mature over time. Studies tracking the development of processing speed, voluntary response suppression, and working memory find that these abilities improve steeply in late childhood and stabilize at different points in adolescence, with adult-level performance often not reached until the mid to late teen years or even later for some specific functions. The prefrontal cortex, which supports these capacities, is one of the last regions of the brain to fully mature. This is not a design flaw. It is the natural architecture of cognitive development. The brain builds from the ground up, establishing the infrastructure for higher capacities before attempting to deploy those capacities. This explains why the moral foundation has to come first. You cannot build higher cognitive capacities on an unstable base. If you try to develop advanced reasoning before executive function is in place, the result is not mastery but frustration and confusion. The knowledge does not stick because there is no infrastructure to hold it. This is why Freemasonry requires demonstrated good character and belief in a supreme being before admitting someone to the craft. This is why the first degree focuses so heavily on building basic integrity, taming unruly passions, and establishing the cardinal virtues of brotherly love, relief, and truth. And this is why the winding stairs begin with the 3 pillars, rather than jumping straight to the more intellectually demanding material that comes later. The winding stairs address this problem directly and explicitly. The 3, 5, and 7 steps form a staged architecture for building the mind. Not randomly, not all at once, but in sequence, with each stage preparing the ground for the next. Foundation first, then refinement, then mastery. This is how the brain actually works, and this is why the winding stairs are not just a beautiful symbol inherited from a medieval guild. They are a practical design for genuine mental development, encoded into the ritual of the Fellowcraft Degree, so that every Mason who receives the degree encounters this system whether he understands it or not. This is the level-up system embedded in the winding stairs. It works not because of magic or allegory, but because it mirrors the actual architecture of cognitive development in the human brain. When you understand this, the Fellowcraft Degree stops being just another ceremony to pass through. It becomes a doorway to a systematic path of mental growth that has been validated by both centuries of Masonic practice and modern science. The 3 pillars, building the moral foundation. The Mason who has developed this pillar does not buckle when the test comes. He has built the neurological and psychological infrastructure that allows him to hold to his commitments even when doing so is costly or inconvenient. Research on character development and moral psychology has consistent and to maintain your course when difficulties arise. And the path forward is unclear. Toddley identified this kind of trait, sometimes called integrity or fortitude, as one of the foundational virtues without which other excellences become unreliable. Beauty represents harmony, balance, and the aesthetic dimension of virtue. The Mason who embodies beauty has developed a sense of proportion between his thoughts, his feelings, and his actions. Nothing is extreme or out of balance. His virtues fit together as a coherent whole rather than existing as isolated traits that occasionally conflict with each other. Beauty is the integration of the other 2 pillars, wisdom and strength, into a harmonious character that functions as a unified system rather than a collection of separate components. When you look at a building that embodies beauty, you perceive not just the individual elements, but how they work together, the relationships between them that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. The same is true of a human character that embodies this pillar. From a cognitive science standpoint, these 3 pillars align closely with what neuroscientists call executive functions. The prefrontal cortex manages the processes that support goal-directed behavior, and the 3 pillars map onto the core capacities that executive function encompasses. Holding goals in mind while working through complex decisions and managing competing demands, that is wisdom. Inhibiting impulses that conflict with long-term aims and suppressing responses that feel natural in the moment, but contradict your deeper commitments. That is strength. Switching flexibly between tasks and perspectives as situations change, regulating emotional responses so they support rather than undermine your larger purposes. That is beauty. Research on cognitive development has established that executive functions continue to mature into the late teens and early 20s. This is not a deficit to be corrected. It is the natural architecture of how human cognitive capacity develops. The brain builds from the ground up, establishing the infrastructure for higher capacities before attempting to deploy those capacities in complex real-world situations. This is why you cannot rush the process and why skipping stages leaves a structure incomplete and unstable. This explains precisely why the moral foundation must come first. Without a solid foundation in these executive capacities, higher learning is unstable. You can acquire information, but you cannot apply it reliably under pressure. You can understand concepts in the abstract, but you cannot integrate them into your actual decision-making when circumstances are difficult or confusing. The knowledge does not become part of you because there is no structure to hold it. It remains surface knowledge that looks like understanding, but fails when it is needed most. This is why Freemasonry requires demonstrated good character and sincere belief in a supreme being before admitting someone to the craft. This is why the first degree focuses so heavily on building basic integrity, taming unruly passions, and establishing the cardinal virtues. And this is why the winding stairs begin with these 3 steps, rather than jumping straight to the more intellectually demanding material that comes later. The architects of the degree understood what neuroscience is only now confirming with modern research methods. The mind must be built in stages, and the foundation must come before everything else. When you pass through these first 3 steps, you are not just learning what wisdom, strength, and beauty mean as abstract philosophical concepts. You are building the neural pathways and the habitual patterns of mind that will support everything that comes after. What does the Doric order have to do with the sense of smell? But they share a common underlying theme. Both are about structure and its relationship to function. Both teach that how something is organized determines what it can do and how well it can do it. The 5 orders of architecture, Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite, represent different solutions to the fundamental architectural problem of how to span space and bear weight while maintaining beauty and proportion. Each order has its own proportions, its own ornamental vocabulary, its own structural logic, and its own aesthetic character. The Tuscan is the simplest and most sturdy, with minimal ornamentation and a focus on raw strength. The Doric is austere and masculine, introducing the characteristic triglyphs and metopes, but maintaining a generally plain appearance. The Ionic introduces the scroll capital in a more refined proportion, representing a more delicate balance between strength and elegance. The Corinthian adds elaborate acanthus leaves and represents the height of ornamental development, with columns that seem almost to burst into flowering forms at their capitals. The Composite combines elements from both the Ionic and Corinthian, creating a more complex and refined solution that synthesizes the achievements of both. These orders were not invented arbitrarily by some central authority. They evolved over centuries of building, each one responding to structural problems and aesthetic preferences that the previous orders had not fully solved. The progression from simpler to more complex orders tells a story about how human beings learn to solve problems and how each solution creates the conditions for the next challenge. The Corinthian order did not appear in a vacuum. It developed from the Ionic, which developed from the Doric, which developed from the Tuscan. Each order preserves the structural achievements of its predecessors while adding new refinements. This is cumulative learning at its finest, and the Masonic writers who placed the orders on the winding stairs understood exactly what they were doing. They were encoding a model of progressive learning into the ritual. For the Mason, studying these orders is not just an exercise in architectural history. It is a lesson in how structure enables function. A column does not merely hold up a roof. It distributes weight along predictable lines, creates visual rhythm that guides the eye, and expresses the character of the building as a whole. The proportions matter as much as the materials. How something is structured determines what it can do and how well it can do it. This principle applies not just to buildings, but to every complex system, including the human mind. When we turn to the 5 human senses, the same principle applies at a different scale. The senses are not passive receivers of information that simply record whatever happens to be out there in the world. They are active instruments of perception that shape and organize experience in profound ways. Modern cognitive science has established beyond reasonable doubt that perception is not a simple recording of external reality. It is an active construction that involves attention, expectation, memory, and inference working together. What you see, hear, or feel is not a direct copy of what is out there in the world. It is a reconstruction your brain builds from the signals it receives, shaped heavily by what you expected to experience and by patterns you have learned to recognize. The hippocampus plays a crucial role in this process, particularly for spatial memory and navigation. Studies using magnetic resonance imaging have shown that intensive navigational experience, the kind that develops in people who work extensively with maps or who travel frequently in unfamiliar terrain, can structurally alter the hippocampus, increasing its volume and changing the density of its neural connections. Touch connects us to the physical reality of the tools and materials we work with. The Fellowcraft is reminded constantly that he works with real things in the physical world, not just abstract ideas. Taste and smell connect us to the more primal and emotional dimensions of experience. The flavor of the wine and the communication, the particular blend of incense that marks the lodge as a sacred space. Together, the 5 senses form a complete system for engaging with the world in all of its richness and complexity. The second 5 steps on the winding stairs refine this perceptual system. They train the Fellowcraft to use his senses as instruments of knowledge rather than just passive receptors of whatever happens to come along. This is the practical work that prepares the mind for the more abstract intellectual operations that come later in the 7 liberal arts. The architecture of thought. The 5 orders of architecture provide more than just examples of structural solutions to architectural problems. They offer a comprehensive framework for understanding how different capacities integrate into a coherent whole that can do things no individual capacity could achieve alone. Each order represents a different principle, and together they demonstrate that complex systems require multiple kinds of coherence operating at once, each one supporting and enhancing the others. The Tuscan and Doric orders are defined primarily by strength and stability. Their proportions are robust, their ornamentation minimal, their overall character one of solid dependability. These orders solve the fundamental problem of how to bear heavy loads without collapsing under their own weight. When we think about the nervous system, these orders correspond to the basic infrastructure, the fundamental reflexes, the baseline arousal levels that keep you alert and responsive, the stable foundation of sensory processing that everything else depends on. Without this base level of functioning, nothing else is possible. The Ionic order introduces balance and proportion as explicit design principles. Its characteristic scroll capital reflects a concern not just with function, but with the visual harmony of the result, with how the structure looks as well as what it does. This corresponds to the next level of sensory processing, the integration of information from multiple sources, the ability to see patterns and relationships that are not immediately obvious, the beginning of true perception rather than mere sensation. At this level, the system starts to organize itself rather than just responding to individual stimuli. The Corinthian order adds ornament and elaboration as legitimate elements of design. This is the stage where beauty becomes more than a byproduct of good function. It becomes an end in itself, something worth pursuing for its own sake. In the nervous system, this corresponds to the aesthetic dimension of experience, the capacity to appreciate beauty, to take genuine pleasure in form and harmony, to experience life as more than just problem-solving and survival. The fully developed nervous system does not just function, it appreciates. The composite order synthesizes elements from multiple preceding orders, demonstrating that the highest form of architectural achievement is integration, bringing different principles together into a coherent whole that draws on the strengths of each while compensating for their limitations. Similarly, the highest form of cognitive achievement is the ability to bring together multiple modes of understanding into a unified perspective that can address problems no single approach could solve. In the Lodge, this integration manifests in the way Masonic symbolism engages multiple senses and cognitive capacities simultaneously. The working tools are not just physical objects to be identified and described. They are symbols that carry layers of meaning that unfold as you contemplate them. The ritual is not just a sequence of actions to be performed correctly. It is a carefully designed sensory and cognitive experience that works on multiple levels at once, engaging both intuitive and analytical capacities in parallel. Research on ritual education suggests that this multi-channel design creates integrated learning experiences that leave deeper and more lasting imprints than single-channel instruction. The 5 steps on the winding stairs prepare the Fellowcraft to engage with the more demanding intellectual work that lies ahead. Before you can work with abstract ideas in the abstract, you need to have the sensory infrastructure to perceive clearly and accurately. This is why the winding stairs after the 5 steps turn toward the 7 liberal arts and sciences. The foundation is set. The senses are trained. Now comes the full curriculum of the educated mind, the systematic development of the higher cognitive capacities that distinguish the master from the apprentice. Subscribe to Masonic Audiobook Library. Follow the light.